The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees encircling the modest wooden cabin, casting a golden glow across the clearing. The mother, Serafina, had lived in this secluded corner of the forest for years, raising her infant son, Zephyr, in solitude. Life here was tranquil, predictable, and secure. She had grown accustomed to the distant calls of wildlife, the rustling leaves, and the occasional howl of wolves under the stars. But that morning, as she stepped onto the porch with Zephyr cradled in her arms, an unexpected sight stopped her cold. Just a few feet away, sprawled across the ground, lay a massive bear. Its thick, shaggy fur was matted with dirt and debris, and its enormous frame rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. The bear was unresponsive, its head resting heavily on the cold earth, eyes barely open. A scent of damp fur and exhaustion hung in the air. Serafina's heart thundered against her chest. She'd glimpsed bears before, usually wandering near the river or deep in the woods, but never this close, never sprawled helplessly at her doorstep. Instinct surged, and she tightened her grip on Zephyr. Clutching Zephyr closer, she stepped back toward the doorway. Every nerve screamed at her to retreat, to put as much distance as possible between them and the creature. Yet something about the bear's condition gnawed at her. It wasn't moving, wasn't reacting to her presence. It looked broken, weak, dying. Zephyr, barely a year old, stirred in her arms and let out a small, curious sound. Then, to Serafina's horror, his tiny hand reached out, fingers opening and closing as if grasping for the bear. A shiver raced down her spine. "Zephyr," she whispered urgently, pulling him back against her. His bright green eyes, brimming with innocence, stayed fixed on the massive creature. He wasn't afraid, far from it, he seemed captivated. The bear exhaled a low, ragged breath, its body twitching faintly, though it didn't rise. Serafina scanned its form, searching for wounds, but nothing stood out. Was it starving? Sick? She couldn't tell, and she wasn't about to risk getting closer. Her instincts urged her to shut the door. The impulse was to lock herself inside, pretend she'd seen nothing, and wait for the bear to leave. But something held her back. The longer she looked, the more she noticed. Its ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat, its fur tangled and dull. This was no healthy bear. It teetered on the edge of collapse. Zephyr squirmed in her arms, his chubby fingers still reaching for the beast. His expression not one of fear but something deeper, as if he grasped something she couldn't. Serafina swallowed hard, torn between terror and a growing thread of sympathy. Minutes passed, and the bear didn't stir. His breathing remained faint, its body still. Serafina glanced at the trees, wondering if this was a trap. Another bear lurking, waiting for her guard to drop. But the forest was silent, unnervingly so. A breeze rustled the leaves, yet the bear lay motionless. Her mind raced. What if it died right there outside their home? What if Zephyr, in his innocent way, sensed something she didn't? The baby whimpered softly, his tiny hand still stretching toward the creature. Serafina hesitated. She'd always trusted her instincts, always relied on nature's balance. But this was different. Her heart pounded as she made a choice that defied every ounce of fear in her. Taking a slow step forward, she kept Zephyr secure in her arms and crouched slightly for a better look. The bear's eyes flickered for a moment, its chest heaving with another shallow breath. It was alive, but only just. Zephyr, still fixated, let out a small coo, and for a fleeting second, Serafina could have sworn the bear's gaze shifted toward him. She wasn't sure what to do, but something told her this wasn't over. Instinct kicked in again, and she pulled Zephyr back, her arms tightening protectively around his small frame. Her breath quickened, her pulse drumming in her ears. This was a wild animal, a massive, unpredictable force of nature. No matter how weak or near death it seemed, it was still a bear. The thought of Zephyr anywhere near it sent a fresh wave of panic through her. But Zephyr didn't share her fear. Instead of shrinking back or crying, he wriggled in her arms with surprising determination, his tiny hands grasping at the air. His wide, wondering eyes stayed locked on the bear as he babbled softly, his light voice full of curiosity. Serafina tightened her hold. "No, baby," she whispered, stepping back toward the porch. "We need to stay away." But Zephyr wouldn't relent. He whined in frustration, his small fist clenching and unclenching. Then, with more strength than she'd expected from someone so little, he twisted in her grip, pushing away, his legs kicking as he arched toward the ground. Caught off guard, Serafina stumbled. The bear remained still, its chest barely moving, only the faintest twitch of its nose betraying life. Even in its weakness, it was a danger. Serafina knew that. Yet Zephyr's unwavering resolve stirred a strange, conflicting emotion in her. She'd never seen him like this. He wasn't afraid, wasn't hesitant. It was as if something deep within him, beyond reason, drew him to the bear. Her mind screamed to retreat to the safety of their home. But before she could act, Zephyr did something that nearly stopped her heart. With a sudden burst of strength, he twisted again, slipping from her grasp before she could tighten her hold. He landed softly on the damp earth, cushioned by the ground. Before Serafina could react, before she could scoop him up, he began crawling straight toward the bear. She gasped, her breath catching as she lunged forward, reaching for him. But something made her pause, something she couldn't name. Zephyr was fearless, his tiny hands pressing into the dirt as he moved closer. His little knees sank into the soil as he babbled again, his voice soft and soothing, a gentle hum against the forest stillness. He wasn't scared, wasn't crying, didn't even glance back for reassurance. The bear lay motionless, its eyes half open, its body lifeless. But as Zephyr inched nearer, something shifted. A flicker, a twitch, a breath. The bear's massive head moved just slightly, enough to show it sensed him. Serafina's entire body froze, her pulse roaring in her ears. She should have grabbed him, run inside, locked the door. But she didn't. She couldn't because something was happening, something inexplicable. Zephyr, still babbling, stretched out one tiny hand. His delicate fingers hovered above the bear's thick, matted fur. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate motion, he touched it. Time seemed to halt. Serafina held her breath, her fists clenched at her sides, every fiber focused on that point of contact. The warmth of Zephyr's skin against the bear's rough coat, the contrast between innocence and wilderness. Then, against all odds, the bear responded. Its massive frame shuddered faintly, a deeper breath rattling from its chest. His head shifted just enough to acknowledge the touch. Its tired, dark eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second, just enough to meet the child before it. For the briefest, most impossible moment, Serafina swore she saw something in the bear's gaze. Recognition. Not fear, not aggression, just a faint hint of something ancient, primal understanding. Zephyr giggled softly, his tiny fingers curling against the bear's fur. He wasn't afraid, wasn't hesitant. He simply accepted the moment. Serafina's throat tightened. She couldn't fathom what she was witnessing, couldn't comprehend the connection unfolding before her. But deep in her bones, she knew this was beyond logic, beyond fear, beyond survival. This was something else entirely. Her breath unsteady, her mind racing, Serafina watched the impossible unfold. Zephyr, her tiny, fragile son, sat inches from the massive beast, his small hand pressed gently against its fur. The bear, this enormous wild creature, didn't move to harm him. It barely stirred, as if even acknowledging the child's touch was a struggle. Fear still pulsed through her, but something else took root. An awareness that this bear wasn't a threat. It was weak, suffering, helpless. Serafina swallowed hard, forcing herself to see past her fear. The bear's body was thinner than it should have been, its fur dull and patchy, its breathing ragged, every inhale a labored effort. Then, for the first time, she noticed its dry nose, its slightly open mouth, its tongue barely visible against cracked lips. Dehydration, she realized, exhaling sharply. It was starving, not just hungry, not just weak, on the verge of death. Her first instinct was to grab Zephyr and run inside, shut the door, call someone, anyone, to handle this. But the reality hit her just as fast. They were miles from civilization, deep in the forest with no help nearby. There was no one to call, no quick fix. Even if she reached someone, she knew how it'd end. A starving bear was a threat in most eyes. They'd eliminate it, not save it. Zephyr babbled softly, his fingers brushing the bear's fur as if sensing something she couldn't. His bright eyes locked on the animal, and in that moment, it felt like he understood what was at stake. Seraphina took a shaky breath, steadying herself. Logic told her to walk away, keep Zephyr safe, let nature run its course. But something deeper, something unnameable, urged otherwise. Her gaze flickered to the bear's massive frame, its shallow breathing. It didn't have long. Against every instinct, she made a choice. Carefully, she scooped Zephyr into her arms and stepped toward the porch. He whined in protest, his tiny hands still reaching, but she shushed him. "Just a minute, baby," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Inside, she placed Zephyr in his playpen, securing him before rushing to the kitchen. Her mind raced, listing what she knew about dehydration, water, food, something gentle. She grabbed a large metal bowl, filled it with water, her hands trembling as she carried it outside. With cautious steps, she approached the bear again, setting the bowl a few feet away. She hesitated, watching for a reaction, but the animal didn't move. She bit her lip, it was too weak to reach it. She should have been terrified, but fear gave way to determination. Carefully, she picked up the bowl and inched it closer to the bear's muzzle, near enough to feel its heavy breaths against her skin. Zephyr cooed from his playpen, as if urging her on. Her heart pounded as she tilted the bowl slightly. A few drops spilled, wetting the bear's dry nose. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then its nostrils flared faintly. Encouraged, Seraphina let more drops fall onto its lips. The bear's tongue twitched sluggishly, catching the moisture. Hope surged in her chest. Slowly, she tilted the bowl further, letting water trickle into its mouth. The bear reacted, its tongue stretching weakly to lap at it. Slow, unsteady, but drinking. Her eyes burned with emotion. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until it escaped in a shaky exhale. She set the bowl down just in front of the bear's muzzle and stepped back, watching as it began to drink. Small, shallow laps, but something. Behind her, Zephyr giggled happily, as if he knew what was happening. Seraphina wiped a hand over her face, releasing another pent-up breath. The hardest part wasn't over. The bear was still weak, still needed help. She turned and hurried inside, grabbing a loaf of bread and a jar of honey. Simple things she knew bears could digest. She tore off small pieces, drizzling them with honey, then stepped back outside. The bear had stopped drinking, its eyes half-lidded again, its strength spent on the water. Crouching a few feet away, she gently placed the bread on the ground and waited. Minutes passed, and she wondered if she'd been too late, if the bear was beyond saving. Then, ever so slowly, it moved. A trembling paw shifted against the dirt. Its nose twitched, drawn by the honey's scent. In the weakest motion she'd ever seen, its head inched forward. Seraphina held her breath as the bear's mouth parted, teeth grazing the bread before its tongue pulled it inside. It chewed sluggishly, every movement an effort, but it was eating. Zephyr clapped from the porch, his tiny voice brimming with joy. Seraphina's lips parted in a breathless, disbelieving smile. She'd done it. She'd saved it, at least for now. Sitting on the porch's edge, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, she watched the bear struggle to eat. The rational part of her screamed this was a mistake. She'd fed a wild animal that could become a deadly threat if it regained strength. It was weak now, barely mobile, but what if it recovered? Would it see her and Zephyr as helpers, or prey? She exhaled slowly, glancing at Zephyr, babbling happily in his playpen. He had no fear, no hesitation. To him, the bear was like a pet. His innocent mind didn't grasp the danger, didn't see this apex predator that could crush them both. Yet something in the bear's gaze lingered, something Seraphina couldn't ignore. It wasn't aggression or feral hunger. It was softer, unexpected. Gratitude, perhaps. The bear's dark eyes flickered open now and then, locking onto hers with an intensity that sent chills through her. Not from fear, but understanding. It was as if the animal knew, as if it recognized the help it had received. Serafina had never believed in fate or unspoken bonds between humans and animals. She'd always been practical, rooted in logic. But this defied sense. The bear was still too weak to move much, but it had lapped up nearly all the water, eaten the bread and honey in careful bites that drained its energy. Exhausted again, its body sagged back to the ground, but something had shifted. It was no longer dying. She knew she should go inside, lock the door, wait for it to leave. Instead, she sat there, her heart torn. Helping further risked making it stronger, strong enough to be a threat. Abandoning it now might mean its death. Zephyr gnawed on his fingers, content but still watching the bear. His green eyes wide with curiosity, fingers twitching as if to reach out again. Serafina swallowed hard. The safest choice was to stop, to walk away. But she couldn't. She'd seen too much. The bear wasn't dangerous, not now, maybe not ever. It was desperate. With a sigh, she rose, brushing dirt off her jeans. The bear's eyes followed her sluggishly, its head tilting faintly. It wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidating her. She hesitated briefly before stepping inside, rummaging through cabinets for something more. Something to build its strength without pushing too far. Living in the wilderness meant sparse supplies, just enough for her and Zephyr. But she couldn't ignore how the bear had looked at her. She found an old jar of peanut butter and a few apples. Meager, but better than nothing. Stepping outside, the bear hadn't moved. She crouched a few feet away, rolling an apple forward. It landed near its paws, but the animal didn't react at first. Zephyr giggled, his feet kicking the playpen's edge. The bear's ears twitched at the sound. Serafina held her breath as the bear shifted. It took nearly a minute before its paw dragged the apple closer. After another pause, it bit into it. Relief flooded her chest. This wasn't a solution, just a delay. But as she watched it chew slowly, its exhausted body struggling, she realized something. Maybe this wasn't about survival, maybe it was about trust. The bear had no reason to trust her, nor she it. Yet here they were, two beings from different worlds in an unplanned moment. Zephyr clapped, his voice bubbling with excitement. The bear's gaze flicked toward him again. Serafina's breath hitched. Would it remember this kindness? She didn't know, but she couldn't walk away now. The next morning, she woke to an unsettling stillness pressing against her chest. Took a moment to recall why something felt off. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, it hit her. The bear was gone. She sat up, listening for the familiar slow breathing outside. But there was nothing. No heavy presence near the porch, no faint rustling of fur. Only distant birdsong and the whisper of wind through the trees. Zephyr stirred beside her, his small body warm, letting out a soft whimper as he stretched and blinked up at her with sleepy eyes. Serafina stroked his fine hair, but her heart lingered in the empty space beyond their home. She didn't know why she'd expected the bear to stay. Deep down, she'd known it would leave once it recovered. That was nature's way. Yet a hollow ache lingered, one she couldn't explain. After preparing Zephyr for the day, she stepped onto the porch, foolishly hoping for a sign it had been real. The clearing was empty. Zephyr babbled, reaching toward where the bear had lain, letting out a questioning sound as he looked up at her. Serafina swallowed hard. "Bear's gone, baby," she murmured. Zephyr frowned, his lower lip pouting as if he didn't understand. Nor did she. For days, she caught herself glancing at the tree line, expecting its silhouette. Each time she stepped outside, she paused, listening for that deep breathing, but it never came. At night, she dreamed of dark eyes watching her. Not with hunger or malice, but with something wordless. The bear had left, yet it hadn't truly gone. Days passed since it vanished into the forest, yet its absence lingered like a ghost around the cabin. Serafina tried to push it from her mind, telling herself it was better this way. She and Zephyr could return to normal. But the empty clearing weighed on her chest. Zephyr still reached toward the woods now and then, his small face curious. He didn't grasp why his silent companion was gone. Late one afternoon, she heard tires crunching on the dirt road to her cabin. An unfamiliar, unexpected sound. No one came this way. Tensing, she scooped Zephyr into her arms and stepped cautiously onto the porch. A dark green truck rolled into view, its emblem marking it as government-issued. Her pulse quickened. The truck stopped, and a man stepped out in a ranger uniform. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes scanning the area. She adjusted Zephyr on her hip, muscles taut. "Can I help you?" The ranger nodded politely. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you. I'm checking the area for unusual animal sightings." His gaze flicked past her to the clearing. "Seen anything out of the ordinary lately?" Seraphina hesitated. Her instinct was to say no. She didn't want the bear hunted if someone deemed it a threat. But his demeanor suggested he wasn't here to harm. "What kind of sightings?" she asked cautiously. He exhaled, crossing his arms. "We've been tracking a bear last spotted a few miles from here. It was in bad shape, malnourished, weak. Thought it might be sick. But when we tried to find it again, it was gone." Seraphina's pulse spiked. "A bear?" He nodded. "Big one. Looked like it hadn't eaten in ages. We figured it wouldn't survive the season." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "But we found fresh tracks. Signs it's still alive, moving stronger now." She swallowed hard, feeling Zephyr shift in her arms, sensing her tension. She knew exactly which bear he meant, and suspected he did too. Her fingers tightened around Zephyr as she met the ranger's eyes. He wasn't just fishing, he suspected something. Torn between protecting the bear and needing answers, she exhaled. "I saw a bear," she admitted cautiously. "It was weak, starving. Collapsed near my house." The ranger's stance stiffened. Interest peaked. "How long ago?" "About a week," she said, glancing at the clearing. "It barely moved at first. I thought it was dying." "What happened?" His voice was calm, but urgency simmered beneath it. Seraphina's heart hammered. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Would he be angry if she'd helped it? But his patient, invested look made her feel she could trust him. "I gave it water," she admitted finally. "Food. Just enough to help." The ranger's face stayed unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but shock. "You helped it?" he repeated, incredulous. She nodded. "It never acted aggressively, just tired, hungry." She paused, then added, "And my son, he wasn't afraid. Kept reaching for it like he understood something I didn't." The ranger let out a slow breath, rubbing his chin. "You don't know how unusual that is," he muttered. A chill ran down her spine. "Why?" His expression grew heavier. "We've tracked that bear for months. It's not just any bear. It was a mother." Seraphina's stomach twisted. "A mother?" He nodded. "Lost her cubs early in the season. Bad conditions, not enough food. We found their remains near the river. Since then, she's wandered alone, refusing to settle, refusing to rest." He paused, voice quieter. "She was dying, not just from hunger, but grief." Seraphina's breath hitched. The bear she'd nursed back to health, who'd shared quiet moments with her and Zephyr, had been a mother who'd lost everything. Reason to live gone. The ranger went on. "That's why we thought she wouldn't make it. Bears that lose cubs like that rarely survive long. They stop trying." Her throat tightened. She recalled how the bear had looked at Zephyr, let him touch it, stayed near even when it could have left. Zephyr had unknowingly given it something lost, a reason to keep going. Blinking back emotion, she murmured, more to herself. She stayed for days. Could have left any time, but didn't. The ranger nodded, his expression softening. "Sounds like she found something unexpected. Maybe your boy reminded her of what she lost." Seraphina glanced at Zephyr, now playing with her sweater, oblivious to the conversation's weight. She thought she was just helping an animal, but she and Zephyr had saved it in a deeper way. Turning back to the ranger, she said quietly, "She left a few nights ago. I think she was saying goodbye." He studied her a long moment, then nodded. Then maybe she's finally ready to live again. Exhaling, Serafina felt the weight in her chest shift. The bear had come broken and left whole. A tearful farewell, but not final. She sensed their paths might cross again. Some bonds, however unexpected, never truly broke. Days turned to weeks, and though the world outside stayed the same, something in Serafina felt forever changed. The bear's presence had marked her life in ways she couldn't have foreseen. Life in the remote wilderness had always been simple, predictable, sometimes lonely. But those fleeting, impossible moments, where she, her son, and a wild animal shared something unspoken, shifted her perspective entirely. At first, she scanned the trees each morning, half expecting the bear waiting in the clearing. It was foolish. Wild animals didn't form human-like attachments, but she couldn't shake the feeling their story wasn't over. Zephyr hadn't forgotten either. Each morning, as she carried him outside, he'd stretch his hands toward the forest, babbling excitedly as if calling his lost friend. Sometimes he'd press his hand to the porch railing, mimicking how he'd once reached for the bear's fur. Serafina watched, her heart swelling, knowing even at his young age, he'd been touched by something extraordinary. She'd never believed in fate, but how else could she explain it? A mother bear, broken by loss, had stumbled into their lives at her weakest, and a tiny, fearless child had given her will to continue. It was more than chance, something deeper, ancient, unspoken, a reminder that nature and humanity weren't so separate. Sometimes, late at night, with Zephyr asleep and the world quiet, Serafina stepped outside to listen. The forest hummed with life, rustling leaves, distant night calls, but never that low, steady breathing from the clearing. Still, she'd whisper into the night, a quiet message carried by the trees. "I hope you're safe." She didn't know if the bear would return. Maybe it had gone to the mountains, found new territory, even started over. But some bonds, however unlikely, never faded. Perhaps one day, when they least expected it, they'd see her again. Not to stay, not to be tamed, but to remind them their connection was real, that it mattered. And maybe, deep in the forest's heart, the bear remembered them too. If the story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We bring incredible tales that highlight the unbreakable bonds between humans and nature. Turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Your support helps us share more unforgettable tales with the world. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.